the lecture for Pauline Kleingeld's Kant's Second Thoughts on Colonialism. So the first point is about race. So Kleingeld has a discussion of Kant's views on race in here. And so this is just to note, we're going to get a lot more of this maybe next week, or if not next week, then we have a week on Kant's views on race coming up. So if you're confused about what she's like, if she's not saying enough, giving enough detail, especially at the end when she starts responding to this guy named Bernasconi. If you're like, I don't have enough to know what to say here, that's fine. We'll get there. Second, the one of the objections she talks about at the end on pages 60 to 61 is she says, and I don't think I can highlight in this thing. So the account I have defended in this essay might appear vulnerable to an objection that Kant's change of mind on colonialism was less radical than I have made it appear. First, against the claim that Kant's later rejection of colonialism was unambiguous, one might point to the passage in the Metaphysics of Morals, in which Kant claims that the sovereign has the right to deport a criminal citizen, quote, to a province outside the country, end quote, where he does, quote, not enjoy any of the rights of the citizen, end quote. Because Kant sometimes equates province and colony, one might be tempted to read this passage as an implicit endorsement of colonialism. After all, how could Kant regard it as justified for a sovereign to deport criminal citizens to a province abroad if he does not endorse the sovereigns having colonies in the first place? So I think this actually came up when we were discussing this section. So if you want to go back and look at the notes or the recording for that class, you can look at what we said about it. So I think the answer I gave, I think I talked about this. I can't remember if I responded or other people. I don't know. The answer I gave is not the one Kleingeld is about to give. Although notice she says, assuming, but only for the sake of the argument that. And so I think she actually thinks the real response is whatever I did when we talked about this, but whatever. Assuming only for the sake of the argument that province here indeed means colony, the answer lies in Kant's broader commitments in the doctrine of right, especially his rejection of the right to revolution. When Kant wrote the book, there were many countries with colonies. Because Kant rejects the right to overthrow one's colonial government, he can consistently combine his criticism of colonialism with a statement regarding the behavior of sovereigns in cases where colonies still exist. His thesis that sovereigns have a right to deport criminals to colonies does not imply that he was convinced there should be colonies, any more than Kant's remark that knightly orders can acquire temporary use rights to land implies that he was convinced there should be knightly orders. So if you think about last week, the lecture on Muthu, where I talked about like how idealized should we read Kant, here Kleingeld is saying, at least for the sake of the argument, really he doesn't have a very idealized theory even of public right, even of civil society, because he's saying, look, in civil society, we have to consider not just like ideal society, but also non-ideal societies that have colonies. And how should they sort of rightfully govern things? Well, they're allowed to deport criminals to the colonies. Should they have colonies? No, Kant is opposed to colonialism. But granting that they do, they shouldn't deport anybody there. And so that, of course, that's not talking about just ideal society. That's talking about societies with colonialism. It's it's complicated because, as she points out, Kant, even in like the ideal, I don't know, Kant rejects the right to revolution, period. And so there is the possibility that like even ideally, like everybody doing what Kant wants them to do, even ideally we could be stuck with bad governments because you can't revolt, you can't overthrow the bad government. So maybe this is still, I don't know, it's like partially ideal in the sense that like ideally, nobody revolts. So ideally, the colonies are sort of stuck there unless you transition in the non-revolution way that Kant described. And of course, Kant is sometimes pessimistic about change. And so maybe this won't happen in some places. So I don't know. But that's just since this point came up in the Muthu lecture and earlier too, I figured I'd note it because it comes up here.